Hello and welcome to the Artisanal Writer. This is our reading series, and we are lucky to have a fantastic young new author in our midst who will be reading from his new novel called Fadom Five. Let me get it up close. Fantastic cover, love. We're the magazine that explores the craft and the practice of writing. So we're going to make an effort when we're talking to David before I set up what his novel's about to sort of focus on those things, those themes as we go along. So just a little, I don't want to give too much away because he has a great section to read from the novel for us. But this is David's first novel, correct, David?
That's right.
Tremendous. And this is his debut. It's a seamless blend of multiple genres, daring feat, not to mention a challenging feat to master in today's pool of literary fiction. The story borrows a little bit from Elizabethan England and mirrors the theme of loss, forgiveness, and redemption that you can find in a lot of Shakespearean works, particularly one of the last plays written by the Bard. He opens with a quote from Shakespeare's The Tempest, and I'd like to read a little portion of it for you. Full Fadom Five, thy father lies, nothing in him that doth fade, but that doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. It's a great one to start with because David kind of sets the stage for the entire arc of the novel in this one little quote. It gives us a glimpse into the sea of torment that's going to follow his main character, Noah Lamarck, his entire life. And he explores a lot of different places, but more interestingly, Canadian spaces. One of them, which I loved so much, was a lot of this takes place against a backdrop of Cape Breton and Camp in particular. At the beginning of the novel, he's running along the rocky shores, and he's trying to escape this growing personal and financial burden that he has, and it's a common thread that's woven through the novel. Noah's just been recently laid off, and he's also attempting to help his ailing grandparents, both of whom are on the cusp of financial ruin themselves, as they try to deal with the grandfather's dementia. And just when all this is seeming lost, Noah and a colleague, Cecilia, get an unexpected, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to examine newly found documents that may fill in some of the missing pieces of Shakespeare's life. So with a hefty financial incentive in hand, Noah can't really say no to this opportunity and heads over to on his own voyage. And in so doing, navigates the reader through some really cool terrain. I cannot wait for him to read because I have so many questions about. He's all over the place. I want to find out if he had one of those yarn maps that we see in TV to like weave all these things together. It is incredible. So without further ado, David, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for having me for this. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so I mean, I'll almost launch straight in. The section I'm going to read is from right near the beginning of the novel. As you said, Noah Lamarck, the protagonist, is among many other problems, coping with the fact that his grandfather's dementia is worsening. His grandmother is, struggling to cope. Anyone who has done any kind of care for somebody who is suffering from dementia knows that it's not really a one-person job. So Noah is back visiting with them, helping to take care of his grandfather a little bit. He has left his estranged wife and their child in Toronto. His wife's name is Kate. His son's name is Felix. They'll be mentioned briefly in the passage I'm going to read. But essentially, Noah has gone, as you said, for a run. He has discovered his grandfather wandering by the ocean side, which is dangerous, obviously. And after getting him back into the house and sort of getting him settled a little bit, He's gone off to have a shower. He has left in his small room upstairs a young woman who has spent the night and who, of course, is not his estranged wife. And so a conversation ensues with his grandmother about all of these things. So without any more ado, I'll just launch into that if it's okay.
Love it. Great setup.
Okay. All right. So, and actually, I'll put on my glasses for this. This is a new prescription. Yes, that's better. All right. Towel in hand, Noah came down the stairs and looked into the kitchen. It smelled of buttered toast. His grandmother was at the stove with her back to him, and he saw how her elbows circled and could hear the rattle and scrape in the porridge pot. He approached and gave her a kiss. Her stiff silver curls tickled his cheek. "Where's Gramps?" he asked. "In the toilet. When I came down, I found him pacing with his tea and talking not a lot of sense. Care to explain?" Noah reached around her to open the oven. He took a piece of toast from inside and then sat at the table. "I might have asked him about Dad." In reflex, his grandmother's free hand went to her hair. Her fingers slid into the curls and curled around them. "Noah, would you please stop doing that? You know it winds him up." "He was down at the water again." His grandmother put down the spoon and turned to him. "Again? Jesus. When I went to start the wash, he was still in bed. I swear I'm going to have to put a bell on him. If you need help watching him, we could get the nurse to come more often, or maybe a leash, or maybe get someone to come full time." Persevering little pockets of air began to pop and whistle through the oatmeal. She turned and resumed her stirring. "That's far too expensive. We can manage." "What about the money I sent you?" Noah asked. "You're always trying to spare yourself short," she answered. "I've got it in an account for Felix." Noah bit into his toast, chewing harder than he needed. "Gran, that money was for you. I can take care of Felix. And we can take care of ourselves." Noah draped his towel over a chair and sat down at the table. The kitchen was warm from the oven and the stove and the steaming kettle. Cramming the rest of his toast, he chewed deliberately for a long while. At last he swallowed. "What was the last offer?" "They wanted to tear the house down, so I told them to forget it," his grandmother said. "Anyway, where would we go?" Each trip home was like watching time-lapse photography of his grandfather's illness. It always seemed to be advancing more quickly than it was, and Noah had to fight against a sense of urgency that caused him to consider the growing need to move his grandparents into a home. While safely in Toronto, he could easily imagine the conversation in which he laid out for his grandmother the various reasons why, but once he got down home again, he blocked right up. Up against the south side of the house behind the lilacs, there was a little nook where he used to play when he was young, and a tire swing on the sugar maple, which he still would use sometimes. Neither kitchen nor bathroom had been renovated in Noah's lifetime, which made the house feel suspended in some decade before he was born. In the parlor, the walls were plaster and prone to cracking, and the carpets were worn around the doorways and charred in little pocks around the fireplace. There was also a small upright piano that his grandfather still could play and did from time to time. On the walls hung his grandfather's charcoal sketches, as well as faded prints of Renaissance paintings. In one corner was their small television, and facing it the rocking chair that Noah's grandfather used to sit in and watch the game on Saturdays. A mirror hung over the hearth, with sconces shaped like candles on either side. On the mantelpiece, numerous pictures were displayed, one of Noah's grandfather kitted out before the war, one of his grandmother with her mischievous grin, mischievous young eyes a twinkle, and her girls, all short-haired and fancied up in their courting dresses, huddled close around her. A few of Noah when he was a child, one of his parents on their wedding day, and one of him and Kate on theirs, and one of Felix from the last time he visited. It was like a side chapel, and Noah's grandmother devoted a little time to it each day to preserve it from any accumulation of dust. These items, and so many others, not to mention all the sounds and smells and daily routines, all reminded Noah that this was their home, and his dead father's too, so that even now, when presented with an opportunity to say what was becoming so obvious, that his grandmother was no longer able to care for her husband and herself and the house too, all on her own, Noah wavered. He could not imagine his grandmother without her kitchen, or either of them without the ocean in their backyard. He balked at the likelihood, his grandmother requiring so little care and his grandfather so much, that they would be housed separately. It was time he nudged them along, but no one knew that after 50 years together, it would break their hearts to be parted. When he tried to speak, he felt his voice penned in. He felt like a cosset, eager to cut loose, but fearful of nipping at the hand that strokes it. He watched his grandmother stir the pot, and the time for speaking passed. She turned her head slightly to look at him. Noah, promise me you'll stop asking him about your father. There's no use plowing a dead field. Noah smiled. That's what he said. She looked at her grandson in surprise. Really? Sort of. Exactly. Sort of. She frowned. I think you've got about as much out of him as you're like to. Some days he's better, said Noah. Some days he hasn't sense enough to make a nickel. The kettle started to squeal, and Noah's grandmother turned to lift it off the burner. Do you want some tea? Noah felt a little pain in his chest as he watched her use the slumped, sodden bag from the saucer. She turned and saw him watching. Waste not, want not, she said. Then she placed the cup and saucer before him on the table. Down the hall, the toilet flushed and the bathroom door opened. The old man then appeared in the doorway and entered the kitchen with his shirt tucked so well into his pants that it poked out through his open zipper. Oh, Peter, his wife said, your fly's down. She moved towards her husband, but Noah reached him first. No worries, Noah said. If it can't get up, it can't get out. Right, Gramps? Noah's grandmother placed 2 bowls of porridge on the table. Lord knows that's the truth. The old man cackled as Noah tucked the shirt tail in and zipped. Come on, Gramps. Noah sat his grandfather down, and remembering how the old man's arthritis sometimes acted up in the morning, took a tube of Ben Gay from an upper cupboard. He squeezed a little into his palm, placed the tube on the table, and began to rub the cream vigorously into his grandfather's hands. The smell of menthol and camphor filled their noses. Oh-ho, the old man said, and whistled in appreciation. Then loudly he said, toast. Yes, yes, dear, it's coming. His wife set a plate of buttered toast on the table and then turned back to the stove. Avi, the old man said, come here. He reached up and took her cheeks in his hands and pulled her lips to his. Receiving his kiss, she placed her hands on his cheeks too and held them there a moment before pulling away. I love you too. Now let me get the dishes started. She turned and started running water in the sink. Now, the old man said, he clapped his hands upright together twice. Now he clapped them again. I'll do it, Noah said, sitting. They held their hands together solemnly and bowed their heads. Then Noah intoned, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, whoever eats the fastest gets the most. Noah, his grandmother said, turning her disapproving face on him. The old man opened his eyes and, smiling, slapped his hands on the table. Good lad, good. Then he took his spoon and began to eat. Noah, you shouldn't make fun. Who do you think taught me? Do you see what a terrible influence you were, Peter? Noah's grandfather still smiled. His grandmother, mildly rueful, shook her head. Then, remembering suddenly, she said to Noah, I forgot about your friend. Shall I make another cup for her? No, she couldn't stay. No. Came in the fog and left in the morning, did she? Noah stiffened. His grandmother put some detergent in the water and started piling in the few dishes that lay on the counter. She began to scrub the porridge pot. When I was growing up, we had a name for girls like that, and it wasn't friend. Nothing so dressed up. Gran, I knew this one girl. The poor dear was so wall-eyed she could lie on her back and look down a well. Thought she had to go grassing up on Skin Hill with all the boys to get any attention. Caused her poor mother no end of grief, God rest her. It was a relief to everyone when she married a nice boy from somewhere away. Of course, that just made her mean and jealous. She dogged him something awful just in case he got up to something. Had eyes in the back of her head almost. She turned off the water. Do you know what the problem is? You're all too casual. Gran, I know. Don't give me your I knows. You ought to know. She bore down equally on Noah and the porridge pot, her elbow and tongue both wagging. You remember what happened to Johnny Mackenzie and Maddie Donovan when they got themselves pregnant? When he told his parents, they kicked him out and told him to get a job. She didn't even tell her parents. She was what, 17? Just going up Fool's Hill. And her parents had warned her if she got herself knocked up, they weren't taking care of her mistake. When they finally found out, her mother swore to me it was just an idle threat, just to keep her in line, and she never thought she'd get herself an abortion. You remember what happened to them? They dropped out of school and shacked up, but they couldn't make enough to make ends meet. So both of them had to go back to their parents with their tails between their legs. And now where are they? I don't know. She put the pot down and turned to face him. Now you're talking sensible. You don't know. And I don't neither. But I bet they wish they could have done things different. Noah wanted to interject, but by now his grandmother was off and steaming like the kettle. And if you don't get yourself pregnant, you get your diseases. You won't believe what I heard the other day when I stopped for tea at the Hortons. There were these two girls talking, and you know what they're teaching them at school? They're teaching that when you sleep with a boy, you sleep with everyone he's ever slept with. Sounds like they've got signs in the corridors and everything down at the high school. And Lord help me, if the one girl didn't say to the other that she kind of liked the thought of that. Said she always had a thing for the girl her boyfriend used to go with, only she was too shy to tell her. Noah watched his grandmother's fair face redden. Honest to frig, she said, the things you hear at the Hortons. Gran, Noah pleaded. She dunked her hands in the water and started washing a teacup. It's no wonder you kids can't stay married these days. You're one to talk, Gran, Noah said, fed up at last. The way Gramps told it, when you two were still courting, he had you over the snowbank behind the curling rink. His grandmother dropped the cup clanking into the sink and spun around. Noah, you mind your tongue. It was different with us. He was my only one, and we both told each other so and meant it. She tried to pick up the glass, but it slipped again from her shaking hands. Damn it, Noah, you've got me all bothered now. She took a deep breath and steadied her hands. Then she picked up the glass again. After several moments of silence, she asked, So, did he tell you anything else? Not that bears repeating. Noah was about to return to his breakfast, but noticed that the tube of Ben Gay had moved, and the cap was off. Glancing up, he saw his grandfather sliding his spoon from between his lips. Gramps, you didn't. It was immediately apparent that he had. The old man started coughing, and mucus began to pour from his nose and down over his lips. Noah quickly snatched a long strip of paper towels, and his grandmother caught her husband under the arms and hurried him to the sink, where he hacked and snorted, and his whole body tried to flush his whole head clean. It took several minutes and dozens of spasms before the old man's body relaxed and the phlegm stopped flowing. Noah's grandmother removed a handkerchief from her husband's pocket and dried his eyes and cheeks and mouth. Wow, the old man said, eyes wide. He smiled, amazed. Gently, she forced her husband back to the table and patted him on the shoulder. Then she turned on her grandson. Jesus, Noah, you can't just leave that stuff lying around. She quickly wetted a new cloth and wiped the table, but that was only the beginning. Realizing that the floor needed cleaning too, she just sighed and sank back against the counter. In the excitement, her curls had become wet and a little wispy. She looked older. Noah slumped into his chair. He no longer had any appetite for the globs of porridge in his bowl. I'm leaving tomorrow, he said, pushing it away. That's good, his grandmother replied, adding hurriedly, Felix will be missing you. Noah agreed. When you go, there's an envelope on the table by the front door. It's some stuff your grandfather's that I found a while back when I was vacuuming behind the filing cabinet. Oh, there's some papers, a few letters he wrote from the war, some newspaper clippings. It's not much. It's not nothing, Noah said. You know, at the convenience this morning, Don told me how Gramps drove his brother to hockey for a whole year when he was on probation. Noah's grandmother opened her mouth in surprise. I'd forgotten all about that. She smiled at her husband, then frowned, then shook her head. He was finished eating and was now licking the empty bowl clean. Why don't you take him somewhere? I've got to get this floor cleaned, and I don't even want to think about the sink. Noah took his grandfather by the hand and led him into the parlor. He sat the old man down on the piano bench and took the rocking chair for himself. He wondered how they would manage and when he would be able to return, and what was in the envelope by the door. In the kitchen, his grandmother was talking to herself. I swear to God, when I said till death, I didn't think he'd live this long. In the parlor, the piano sang with the perfectly remembered notes of Ma Virginie.
Oh, that's such a great passage to have shown us, because you do get such a strong connection that Noah has to his family. I loved that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I really did. And it's also for me, like, because as I mentioned in the opening, you do move all around in the book. What I think anchors it are these really strong relationships that you build in the writing.
Mm.
So, I'd love to get back to, like, you do go all over the place. How
Yeah.
did you keep it all together? Did you map it out?
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, it's a little tricky. In a sense, yes, but in a more accurate sense, not the way you think. I didn't use. I know some writers use a kind of storyboarding. Some
Yeah,
writers use like a big map of something, and they just write everything, and then they sort of, draw lines. And I
yeah,
mean, there are
yeah.
lots of ways to keep these things separate. No, I keep a lot of notes,
Okay.
and I sit on things a long time, so I kind of I'm a slow writer by nature,
Yeah.
um, when I'm in the planning stages, and so I sit with it a long time, and so a lot of the things that would seem like it's hard to keep track of in the different
Right.
locations, um, over time it gets easier and easier for me because I'm like building in the story in my head before I'm actually putting a lot of it down on paper.
Right. And
Uh,
you're clearly writing towards something, right?
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing where when I have a shape for the whole story, even when I don't know all the different stops in between, I know some key points that I'm going to be getting to. So keeping a lot of those things clear in my head, that wasn't actually as hard as it would sound.
Yeah.
The difficult the difficult part was simply how many details I filled into each of those relationships, and trying to figure out, okay, which of these details do I need to keep? Which ones do I need to
Gotcha.
carry forward to later? So that was, so I think the easiest way to explain it is, as I had drafted more or less the entire thing with, little holes here and there were a lot of times where I wouldn't be producing anything new. I would be simply reading through and kind of listening to my own story and saying, oh, right. So I should do this and I should do this. So it's almost a little bit like, it's almost a little bit more like embroidering. You know,
Gotcha.
you've got everything mapped out, you've got the
Right.
fabric there, and then afterwards you say, okay, now I can take this and this and this and
And
this.
then I can weave in the color. The cringy
Exactly.
bits with the grandma.
Yeah.
Talking to grandma. I love
Yeah,
that.
and questions about how does that affect things later in the story.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have a vague sense, but the details can come later.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of back writing, let's say.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's how, I mean, I recognize that it does seem really spread out and
No, but I love that
in a
though.
lot of ways. And how does it all come together? It was a lot of going back and pulling
Yeah,
everything,
because David,
like
it's super
yeah.
hard to do. Because you want to, as a writer, you want to go off in a tangent, but it's almost like you knew when to pull back. Maybe this happened in the draft process, but like it all magically and fluidly comes together at the end, which is what I loved.
It was
Kudos to you for that.
there were a lot of threads to keep tightening and tightening until
Yes.
towards the end. So
Did a
that's
lot of your Shakespearean, like, because I know you teach at Cégep level in Quebec, so, and I know you must be teaching Shakespeare. So
well, I used to, yes, I used to teach it quite a bit, and
no
and as
more.
I was writing this, so yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So did a lot of that inform the piece, or was it just like present of mind? Because of obviously the title, right? And the
Yeah.
Shakespeare quote.
Well, I mean, certainly in terms of the overall shape of the story, and even on the level of the story I wanted to tell, I had Shakespeare's romances, and particularly The Tempest, kind of firmly in mind. Like I thought, this is a story structure that I'm really interested in exploring. So on some level, I had sort of large structure type stuff in my head as I was working on the story, and obviously as I was teaching, I was also just sort of paying attention to things that sort of jumped out at me. I've been asked this question before because there's a lot of other sort of little bits of Shakespeare woven in here and there. Some of it's whimsical, some of it's even trivial, but it sort of lends to the atmosphere of the thing. Other parts obviously are much more serious, places where I'm structuring things in order to echo a Shakespearean story or something like that. When I've been asked what kind of, research or how much, of my teaching got in. What I end up saying is, the course I was teaching most often when I was writing this was a course in acting Shakespeare for non-actors.
Cool.
So we would do a course where we would, I would teach them a lot of basic acting work, and then we would, over the course of the semester, we would learn to perform for ourselves an excerpted version of a play. And weirdly, that was by far the most useful thing I did for writing the story, because I spent so much time simply reading, talking, listening to performances. The language really just sort of got into my sort of subconscious a little bit. And so weirdly, when I was not really consciously researching, that was the most useful stuff.
Oh, right on.
Yeah, it was
What
really.
sort of stuff resonates for you outside of the stuff that you teach? Like when you're on your own, just reading on your own, who are some of your faves?
It's such a good question. I'm really idiosyncratic, and I'm really fickle as well. I have friends who tend to read everything by an author. I don't usually. I will usually read one or two things and say, all right, I get a feel for this, I want to try something else. Some authors that I've really enjoyed recently would be, I'm in the middle of War and Peace, which is pretty phenomenal. I put it off for a long time. It's pretty amazing. Tolstoy has this way of conjuring an entire character with a few deft choices of details. It's really something. And it's also just really enjoyable to read. Lydia Davis, I really like a lot. I go back to her quite frequently. She's an incredibly economical writer, which is and a very different writer from the kind of writer that I am. Yeah. So I like seeing, alternatives to the way that I tend to write. It sometimes helps me to avoid some of my worst habits as a writer, right? So there are lots of other things. I tend to go back every now and then to Joyce a lot.
You love a dense, right? You love a dense
I really do. I really do.
That.
I don't do a lot of pleasure reading in conventional sense. Probably the closest thing I get to pleasure reading is I like a lot of nonfiction.
Awesome.
So if I'm just going, I just want to read a couple of chapters or something, I'll usually pick up a book on bird. I'm looking at my bookshelves here, like a book on birds or trees in Canada, or something like that. That to me is more relaxing. When I read fiction, particularly, I tend to be a little bit more intense about it.
Gotcha. I know this is a big thing to sort of bring towards the end, but loss does play such a big part and it's tough to write about. It's at the center of this book. So how did you sort of approach dealing with it and bring it to the fore? Because it can not bog your writing, for lack of a better word, but it can change the way the narrative's structured, right? So how did you there are so many ways in the novel that you showcase it, but tell me like how it shaped you in the writing as you were writing it.
As I was writing it, it's interesting. I would say in many ways I have been very fortunate in that I have not suffered many of the kinds of losses that I know a lot of people do by the time they reach my age. I have two parents who are healthy. I have lost all of my grandparents, and eventually, but that comes with age. So in some ways, what I've often looked to is people that I've comforted when they've lost people,
right?
And I think weirdly, I find it easier to use those experiences that I've had as a sort of a support for somebody else's loss. I have found that more useful as a writer, because I'm seeing it from the outside, which for me anyway, the danger is if I write my own life, I never see it clearly enough to give it a really good shape.
That's so true.
Other writers,
hard to step away, right?
I find it that way anyway. I know a lot of other writers, thrive on fictionalizing their own lives. There's lots of things in my writing that, are sparked by something that has
Sure.
happened, transient thoughts, short experiences. But when it comes to building a work of fiction, I really struggle with my own experiences as a source. And so I just try to be a really, really attentive person in the presence of others.
Yeah, like
Not
the
really-
empathy in the pieces that are about the dementia and the
Mm.
grandfather, like those really shine through, I think, in this novel.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I
With that.
will confide this. I did. My wife's grandparents both suffered from Alzheimer's, and I did at one point spend 5 weeks doing 24-hour a day in-home care for
Wow,
them. Yeah.
that'd be formative.
It was 5 weeks. It wasn't very long, and it was very, very difficult. And it's probably one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in my life.
You.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, and so it's not like, oh, these are all things that happened when I was,
No, but you
but
wouldn't forget that.
yeah, and you get a sense of the energy of people who are suffering from dementia, and also people who are trying to help those people, because I was known to my wife's grandparents, but I also was not, their children or grandchildren.
Yeah,
So I was in this weird sort of liminal space between, a family member coping and a stranger coping.
yeah.
So there was a lot that I absorbed just from the experience of being with them that helped me to, I think, imagine I think fairly clearly what it would be like for the people suffering from it, and the people trying to help the elderly when they suffer from dementia.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's
so
just
yeah,
I thought it was a really great part of the book, a real empathetic part of the book, which I just thought I wanted to let you know that I really appreciated it.
no, thank
And
you.
we don't have much time. We only have about 4 or 5 minutes left, but I would love to hear about, you clearly have a very strong relationship to Shetty Camp. And I just wanted to point that out because they're also on your website. You had a beautiful poem about Shetty Camp. And I would, before we leave, tell me about you and this relationship to the sea that you have.
So yeah, it's a bit weird. I'll try to keep it a bit short. So the novel itself is set in an invented, a Cape Breton town called Mission Point, which I kind of imagined was more towards the Sydney part of Nova Scotia.
Right.
But as it happens, my grandfather's family, it was an Acadian family, 17 kids,
What?
just, oh yeah, 10 boys.
Wow.
Yeah, my grandfather always insisted they were their own gang in town. It was, yeah. So the family began in Shetty Camp and then moved down to Sydney with the family looking for work and that sort of thing. And then my grandfather at 18, he left Cape Breton entirely and came to Ontario. And he became, the classic French-speaking Canadian in Ontario at that time, who realizes speaking French is a good way to not be liked in Southern Ontario. I mean, this is a long time ago. And so he basically forgot almost all of his French. Um, and one of the things I found really interesting, and it sort of informs the story, is this question of how do things get transmitted, right? How do legacies and inheritances get passed on to people? And for me, I've only ever visited the East Coast of Canada a couple of times. So there's no good reason why I should feel a connection there beyond the fact that I loved my grandfather and he was a very unusual character in my hometown.
Exactly.
I think there's a lot of who he was kind of seeped into me. You're not the only one to say, oh, you must spend a lot of time down east. No, only a couple times.
Wow.
Weirdly, I just feel this intense connection there for reasons that I can't really explain.
Well, David, it's in the
Um,
blood. It's got to be in the blood.
it's a very strange phenomenon, I think, but
Yeah.
it's clearly something that happens. So that's why so much of the Cape Breton and the seashore and it's in there somewhere.
Well, I'm glad you could carve a little bit of time out for us.
Oh,
This
it's my
book
pleasure.
is incredible. Here it is again, full Fadom Five, and c'est vraiment, vraiment
Oh, merci beaucoup.
beauté. It was beautiful. And wish you the best with it, and I hope that it finds the audience that it deserves. And I'm just glad that you could carve some time out for us today.
It was a pleasure, and I mean, thanks so much for taking an interest in reading it. It's I really appreciate it.
It's gonna find its people, David, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Good luck with it, and thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye now.
Bye-bye.